On November the 3rd, 2020, people from across the state of Oregon went to the polls to vote on a variety of issues, ranging from campaign finance to tobacco taxes. These measures were overshadowed by a slightly larger election going on at the same time, so while everybody was watching the two pensioners punching it out, Oregon quietly decriminalized all drugs statewide. Before you start freaking out wondering why Oregon just decided to give 5-year-olds crack cocaine, let's take a step back and actually look at the measure the people of Oregon voted for. The full measure that was on the ballot was Oregon Measure 110, Drug Decriminalization and Addiction Treatment Initiative. A vote yes supported making non-commercial possession of a controlled substance no more than a Class E violation, with a max fine of $100, and establishing a drug addiction treatment and recovery program funded in part by the state's marijuana tax revenue and state prison savings. As you can see, the actual measure is a bit more beefy and complicated than just making all drugs legal, and you can start to see why over 1.3 million Oregonians voted for it. However, to truly understand why the people of Oregon voted for Measure 110, we have to go back in time 10 years to the year 2001 and travel 8,000 kilometers across the Atlantic to Portugal. Portugal's story starts in the 1980s, when the country was plunged into a public health crisis the world had never seen the likes of before. Portugal had just abruptly exited 40 years of authoritarian rule, and the population was woefully underprepared for the flood of drugs that entered the country. Almost overnight, Portugal went from a country where owning a cigarette lighter required a license to the drug capital of Europe, and drug-related illness skyrocketed. HIV and hepatitis infection rose to all-time highs of 104 cases per million in 2000 and showed no signs of stopping. After years of unsuccessful attempts to curb drug use, the government of Portugal invited experts on addiction and drugs to design a way out of the nation's public health disaster. And in July of 2001, a nationwide law came into effect that decriminalized all drugs. It's important to note that if a person is caught with more than the average dose for 10 days use, they can still be charged with drug trafficking, and the legalization only applies to consumers, not producers of illicit drugs. Some of you may still be wondering why Portugal decided to decriminalize all drugs in the middle of a public health crisis created by the very same drugs that are now legal. After all, it does seem pretty counterintuitive. In order to understand why Portugal and Oregon have taken this step, you need to understand the ideas behind harm reduction. Harm reduction is typically seen as an alternative to the prohibition strategies most of you watching are probably familiar with. These include cracking down on drug use and making both the consumption and production of drugs illegal and jailable offences. One of the best examples of this is the war on drugs in America, and the thousands incarcerated due to drug-related offences. On paper, this strategy seems sound. You reduce the number of drugs on the street, reduce consumption, and make the world a better place. The only problem is that it doesn't work. During the 1980s, the US started to pursue a harsher drug policy, utilising drug law enforcement to increase sanctions associated with drug-related crime. However, during this period of increased drug policing, consumption did not decrease, and the street price of drugs actually fell. There is little evidence showing that prohibition tactics work, and increasing evidence that the war on drugs has only negatively impacted people who take drugs, not those who sell them. In fact, prohibition likely increases violence in drug markets and makes it harder for people who are addicted to substances to use safely and cleanly, which promotes the spread of diseases such as HIV and hepatitis. Due to prohibition's historic failure, a new model is needed for governments to tackle drug-related issues, and that is where harm reduction comes in. The idea behind harm reduction is that we stop treating people addicted to substances as criminals, and we start treating them as people who need help with their situation. It's important to remember that harm reduction and regulation of drugs are not policies that aim to reduce the number of drugs in circulation or address the underlying problems of problematic drug use. But what they do offer is a safe environment for drug users and overall better public health. But what does harm reduction look like, and does it even work? Harm reduction is a catch-all term for many different policies that aim to promote public health, ranging from clean needle exchanges to full-on drug consumption rooms. However, a common theme is treating problematic drug users as people who need help and not criminals that need prosecuting. Understandably, people may be a bit apprehensive about opening up drug consumption rooms, creating needle exchanges, and decriminalizing drugs. After all, won't this promote drug use and make drug dealers richer? Well, Let's take another look at Portugal again. After Portugal's decriminalisation, HIV and hepatitis infections plummeted from an all-time high in 2000 of 104 new cases per million to only 4.2 per million in 2015, one of the lowest rates in Europe and the world. However, this was not entirely due to the change in law, but also the harm reduction plan that was put into effect. Decriminalisation made the harm reduction strategy that Portugal employs possible, with needle exchanges and drug rooms being set up across the country. It is these facilities that allow safe drug use that help combat the crisis. As well as these facilities, there was a massive campaign to destigmatise drug use in the public eye, which successfully got the public on board with the plan, to the point that no political parties apart from the fringe far right want to recriminalise drugs. There were fears, of course. Nobody wanted drug rooms in their area, and fears of people coming to Portugal to take drugs were widespread. However, these fears never came to be. 95% of people cited for drug offences every year since decriminalisation have been Portuguese, and close to zero are citizens from other EU states. Drug prevalence rates in 15 to 19-year-olds have actually decreased since decriminalisation, and in almost every category of drug, and for drug use overall, lifetime prevalence rates were higher pre-decriminalisation compared to after legalisation. Along with this, drug prices did not decrease as feared, and the retail price for cocaine and opiates is no lower following drug decriminalisation. The evidence is clear. Portugal's policies have been highly successful in their goals while not promoting drug use. Looking back across the Atlantic to Oregon, it is clear to see parallels between Oregon and pre-legalisation Portugal. Oregon and the US as a whole are in the grips of an opiate-driven health crisis, with Oregon leading the US in pain reliever misuse, number 2 for methamphetamine misuse, and number 4 for cocaine and alcohol use disorder. It is clear that Oregon needs a new approach, which is where Measure 110 comes in. The bit of Measure 110 that people look at first is the bit about decriminalisation, but often overlooked is the end of the measure, which establishes a drug addiction and recovery program funded in part by the state's marijuana tax and state prison savings. Ever since 2014, when weed was legalised in Oregon, all revenue above $11.25 million a quarter is redistributed towards common school funds, drug services, state police, and the local health authority. What Measure 110 aims to do is redirect funds away from these areas and towards the drug addiction treatment and recovery program. Grants from this fund will be given to community-run organisations to create addiction recovery centres that must provide treatment 24/7, offer health assessments, intervention plans, and outreach. Not only will marijuana revenue fund the program, but savings from state prisons will also be redirected into the fund. Decriminalisation is estimated to save $24.5 million from 2021 to 2023. These savings will be from reduced arrests, prohibition supervisors, and incarceration costs, with state prison savings and marijuana revenue estimated to grow to $182.4 million in 2021 to 23. The program should have adequate funding to combat the health crisis, like the highly successful program that Portugal implemented years ago. While we won't know how successful Measure 110 will be, the evidence from other areas suggests that Oregon will soon join the list of successful harm reduction strategies, along with Portugal and San Francisco, who also run a highly successful harm reduction program. Since 2003, Narcan, a drug that reduces overdoses from opioids, has been provided free and has prevented thousands of overdoses in San Francisco. As a result, the city has one of the lowest fatal overdose rates in the US. The district attorney has even visited Portugal, looking at their success story and how to replicate it, and said, "We're not going to get anywhere by criminalising people for this." With Portugal, San Francisco, and potentially Oregon, the list of harm reduction success stories keeps growing, and other parts of the world could stand to learn, including somewhere closer to home for me, Scotland. Scotland has a long and complicated history with drugs, and since the 1980s has had significant issues with heroin, opiates, and now benzos. This long history now means that Scotland is facing an aging population of older men who have been addicted for decades, leading to a public health crisis that may sound familiar. In 2019, 1,264 people died of drug misuse, a figure that is 6% higher than 2018, and part of a larger trend of increased drug deaths in Scotland. The scale of Scotland's issue doesn't really become apparent until you start to compare them to other EU countries. Scotland has 295 drug deaths per million, which is more than double Sweden, who is the second highest in deaths, and 3.5 times higher than the UK as a whole. It's worth mentioning how low Portugal is on this list and how high Sweden is, who coincidentally has a very harsh drug policy and little harm reduction action. These figures are astounding when put into context, and there has been a lot of finger pointing in the media without much action being taken. Glasgow City Council, backed by the Scottish Government, has been calling for legal powers to set up a drug consumption room for years. But drug laws are a power reserved for Westminster, and the Home Office has consistently dismissed proposals. In fact, the Prime Minister, Mr Johnson, has said that drug consumption rooms just encourage drug use, a statement that is not only false, but completely misses the point of what drug rooms are set up to do in the first place. With attitudes like this towards harm reduction, it's easy to see why nothing has been done about this health crisis. However, there are still things that could be done without Westminster's approval. The Lord Advocate could release a letter of comfort stating that drug consumption rooms could operate without fear of criminal prosecution, essentially being illegal with no enforcement of the law. In fact, this has already been done, as earlier last year he provided similar guidance for Naxalone, when nobody will be prosecuted for supplying the life-saving drug. However, the Lord Advocate said in 2017 that change needs to come from Westminster law before action can be taken, which is technically right, but the people dying from preventable overdose in Scotland don't really care about technicalities. Across the globe, attitudes towards drugs are changing. The younger generations are more liberally minded, and it is starting to show in policy, with marijuana legalization being openly debated and legalized across the US, and the war on drugs being more widely accepted as a failure. However, we still have a ways to go, and I genuinely hope that the people of Oregon tackle their problem with drugs effectively and efficiently, to not only help those in need, but to provide a new model for other nations and states to copy. Drug deaths are still high across the EU and America, and we need to look at the science and admit that prohibition doesn't work, and that harm reduction is a viable alternative. However, it isn't a silver bullet, and unless we start realising that addiction is a disease and not a character flaw, we will never be able to help those who really need it the most, and it will only cost you more in the long term in terms of taxes. Well, there we have it. Thank you all for watching until the end of the video. This video took way longer to make than it should, but it's out now and I have some ideas for future videos already, so hopefully it shouldn't take another 6 months for the next one. To make sure you catch it when it comes out, join the Discord in the description and follow me on Twitter for any updates. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.